I'm a psychologist. And so my work comes from that particular perspective, but I do work with a lot of economists as well. So some of the research I'm going to talk about today is from the economic side. And I'll give the link to our website at the end, but the studies that I'm going to talk about today, a lot of them, they're listed on that website, so you can go and look more into them afterwards if you're interested. My own work is more on how to increase inclusion and diversity rather than on discrimination at the moment. So most of what I'm doing is on how we can get more diverse people into the workplace and into the labour market and into organisations, rather than on the discrimination side. But I'm sure that Anne is going to talk a lot more about that next month. So I'm going to touch a little bit on discrimination, though. So here's a quick overview of what I'm going to talk about today. Just introduce diversity and inclusion, what the benefits and challenges of diversity in organisations is, some barriers to that, and then, some ideas about how we might encourage more diversity and promote inclusion. Okay. So what do we mean by diversity? Society is diverse. People are diverse in all sorts of ways. When we think about diversity in the workplace and in the labour market, we probably think first about things like multiculturalism, ethnicity, migration, gender. And of course, in the global workforce that we have today, and with globalisation, we have very much more diverse workplaces. We do have a lot of movement in the labour market. We have a lot of movement between countries. So increasingly, organisations are multicultural. But diversity exists in lots of different ways. Age, for example, and another thing that's happening to our labour market is that people are having to work longer because we have an ageing population, we have slower birth rates, so we have an ageing population that we can't sustain through taxes and pensions. So we're seeing pension age rising in many countries, which is controversial, and people are having to stay in the workplace longer. So we're having more diverse workplaces in terms of age, as well as things like gender, of course, gender identity, disability, ethnicity, sexual orientation. These are things that tend to be protected in anti-discrimination or equality laws in European countries. There are, of course, massively other aspects in which we can be diverse that might not be protected in equality law, but might be beneficial things to have in the workplace, like neurodiversity, although that might count as disability. There are things like social class, which typically left out of equality law. And things like attractiveness. I mean, this might influence your job prospects. In fact, we know from research it does influence job prospects. There are lots of ways in which people might be diverse, and that might lead them to differential outcomes in the labour market. So what is EDI or DEI? Probably all heard about it. Maybe you know what it is. It's pretty much, if you see EDI or DEI, it pretty much means the same thing, just in different order. Diversity, equality and inclusion, or equality, diversity and inclusion. Or sometimes the word equity might be used instead of equality. And the word equity tends to be used a lot more in North America. And the word equality tends to be used a lot more in a European context. So what's the difference between equality and equity? Equality stands for us all having an equal chance, no matter who we are. So nobody being discriminated against, everybody having a fair chance, the same. Equity, it implies that some people are already disadvantaged. And if some people are already not on a level footing with others in the labour market, then they might need some special help to get up to the same level. Because if one group is down here to start with, then they're already disadvantaged and they may need some help to get them up to the level of other groups. Now, that's a concept that's more controversial because that implies that we might engage in practices like, for example, positive discrimination, which you see in some countries, like Canada, for example, where they have a list of groups who are disadvantaged. And you can, in fact, advertise jobs and vacancies just for that group because they're underrepresented. So you could advertise a job that is only Indigenous people. But in most European jurisdictions, you can't engage in positive discrimination, but you can engage in what's called positive action or affirmative action, where you might have some targeted approaches to try to encourage people from underrepresented groups. So you might, for example, say any disabled person who applies for the job will be interviewed, but you can't give them a job on the basis they're disabled. You're normally not allowed to do that in European jurisdictions. So equity and equality, this is why we tend to use the word equality rather than equity in a European context, where we don't have positive discrimination typically. So, of course, inclusion refers to an environment where everybody feels respected, valued, and has equal opportunities. So what's good about diversity? Let's go through a few things. Well, what's bad about non-diversity? What's bad about homogeneity? One of the things psychologists have been studying for some decades in organisations and groups is how we make decisions and whether we make good or bad decisions. And this term groupthink is one that maybe some people are familiar with. Groupthink is the idea that when you have a particularly homogenous group, a group of people who are very similar in backgrounds, interests, maybe qualifications, experiences, the same type of people, will tend to, after an amount of time, they might tend towards some very bad decision making, which is very narrow in their thinking, unable to see outside of the box, unable to see alternatives, might be labouring under shared illusions. They will not listen to advice from outside, even from experts who are meant to advise them. And this results in very dangerous and risky decision-making sometimes, unethical decision-making, or just decision-making that can be very bad for an organisation. Now, this term was first used to discuss the Bay of Pigs invasion, which some of you know a bit about history might know what that was. There's a picture of a meeting here, John F. Kennedy, President of the United States, and his advisors, who organised an invasion of Cuba to try to depose Fidel Castro and the communist regime. They backed Cuban rebels, and they were convinced that all the people of Cuba hated Castro so much that as soon as these troops landed, they were going to join in and they would overthrow the communist government. But it turned out that they were not so unhappy. And when they landed troops, it was a disaster and nobody joined in, and the invasion was defeated. And this was a huge scandal for the American government to be involved in this. But it turns out that all their advisors, like the FBI and the intelligence services, were telling them that they should not be doing this, that the people didn't support it, and they were giving them correct intelligence, but they were ignoring it because they had these shared beliefs and delusions and they were not listening to outside evidence. So this is the first instance that came to be known as groupthink. But we see lots of evidence of this. I've given you a link here. If you go and look up the Challenger shuttle disaster and groupthink on YouTube, you can see a very interesting little documentary about how groupthink led to a very dangerous decision, a fatal decision, in fact, in the team that were launching NASA's shuttle Challenger, which blew up on launch. So groupthink is a quite dangerous thing for organisations, and that's something that comes from very homogenous groups. Groupthink is a lot less likely in diverse groups. So that's one big advantage of having diversity in organisations. We can avoid dangerous groupthink. There's also, of course, power thought, ethical and social justice motivations for inclusion and diversity in the workplace. We have to comply with equality laws and regulations like EU regulations that require us not just to not discriminate, but also to take active measures to try to have more inclusive and diverse workplaces. If we have diverse customer bases, and increasingly in the globalized marketplace we do, then it makes sense also to have diverse teams of employees who can understand and communicate with your diverse customer base. So it makes sense from that point of view. We know that actually there's a link between employee satisfaction and engagement and culturally diverse workplaces as well. More diverse teams are more satisfied, and particularly younger generations in the labour market seem to place a heavy importance on diversity and inclusion in the workplace. It's one of the things they look for in a desirable employer of choice. It may lead also to better problem solving. So diverse teams might be more creative, for example, the more homogenous ones. Quite a nice study by Freeman and Huang looked at Web of Science articles. So articles being published in academic journals, and they looked at how much they were cited by other researchers. So this is a measure of how influential those papers are, if they're being cited by lots of other researchers in their papers. And they found that there was a correlation between diversity of the authors of papers and how many times papers were cited. So positive correlation. So the more diverse author teams had more influential papers. Now, that might be for a number of factors, but it seems to suggest there's a good thing about diversity in academic research teams. They might be more creative, diverse teams, particularly in environments like agile workplaces, though they may also take longer time to do things because there's more conflict, for example. Talk a little bit about that more. And if you want to attract the widest pool of employees, obviously you're going to cast your net diversely. If you have diversity in your workplace, you've got a huge number more people to recruit from. And it seems like this is something that people increasingly are looking for in an attractive employer. So there's lots of reasons why diversity might be beneficial for organisations. More controversially, there is a financial case for diversity. So there are correlations between some measures of financial performance of companies and their diversity in various ways, particularly things like looking at correlations between board diversity and the board of companies and their financial performance. And McKinsey produces a series of surveys called Diversity Matters, which shows correlations and has continually done so over the last 10 years. This is correlational data, though, so we're not clear if there's any causation between the relationships here. Because a company is diverse and financially successful, we don't know which of those things is causing the other. Maybe companies that are more financially successful are more diverse. It's not the diversity that's making them successful. Or it may be that there's some third factor involved in the financial success that has got nothing to do with gender diversity, for example, which is one of the things that's been looked at. So we're never sure about correlational data as to whether this really implies there's some causation here. But we do know there is a relationship between diversity and financial performance on some measures. It doesn't always work, but there's some evidence of this. So what are the challenges of diversity. Group cohesiveness and conflict is less. Conflict is less, and group cohesiveness is better in homogenous groups. Although, as we know, it can also lead to groupthink. Not always, but it can do. Homogenous groups also communicate more and in a variety of ways because they understand each other more. They're from the same backgrounds. They tend to communicate in similar ways. So there's more misunderstandings and conflict in diverse groups in the workplace. But conflict has good and bad sides. In particular, we would distinguish between two types of conflict, which is task conflict and personal conflict. So personal conflict's the kind of conflict you might think about when you have an argument with someone, you don't get on with them, and that's obviously a bad thing in the workplace. Task conflict, however, is where you get disagreements on how to solve a problem. Now, task conflict turns out to be pretty good. Although it might take people more time to solve the problem, they're more likely to come up with innovative solutions to problems. Because if you have a team that's everybody's thinking the same way, you're going to have a narrow set of alternatives that you're thinking about to solve a problem or an innovation. If you have someone who comes in and says something completely different, then you're more likely to start thinking about wider sets of alternatives and more innovative solutions. So task conflict increases, and that might be a good thing. There's no evidence, well, not in these studies anyway, that personal conflict increases. So it seems like if there is an increase in conflict, maybe it's the good type of conflict. But there is process loss involved in problem solving in diverse teams, which is it takes more time, etc. And this is mainly because people misunderstand each other quite a bit if they're a more diverse team. So it takes more time, and it takes more time to resolve things like conflict and how you're going to move forward. So there are advantages and disadvantages and challenges with diversity and diverse work teams. There also tends to be a link between high staff turnover and diversity. So people leave organisations, and this might be because of discrimination and problems with integration. So if you're from an underrepresented group in the workplace and you suffer from problems with integration or discrimination or feeling left out or not feeling belonging, then you're more likely to leave. So we know that there is higher turnover typically in more diverse organisations. And it also might be related to things like people coming from migrant workers, people coming from different places and moving on. So there's a naturally high turnover as well. Diverse groups, therefore, are challenging and need to be managed a lot more, and are more likely to be off task or take more time if they're self-managed teams. So what are barriers to increasing inclusion and diversity? So there are a few causes of underrepresentation in the labour market, why certain groups are underrepresented, particularly perhaps in some sectors or professions. One of these is personal factors. So, for example, the fact that there are fewer women in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics professions, is partly because girls and boys have different interests. So when they're at school, they tend to specialise in different subjects. And this might be down to socialisation, of course, that girls are socialised into being more interested in people, and boys are socialised into being more interested in science and technology and so on. So there might be learned differences, but it seems to be the case that there are strong preferences that start fairly early in school. So you won't have lots of women in STEM if they're choosing not to go into those paths very early on in their school days, and don't qualify in those sorts of subjects. When they do qualify in those sorts of subjects, there is also something called the leaky pipeline. So this is where you might have people who are doing degrees in say, for example, women doing STEM degrees and then dropping out of STEM and not going into a STEM profession. Now, there's lots of debate about this and why it happens and whether it happens or not. But one of those aspects, in fact, might be, for instance, competitive workplaces. If we're talking about women in tech, for example, those competitive workplaces are not very attractive to women. So women who have STEM degrees may then not go into workplaces that they perceive to be very competitive, macho, lots of men, not many other women. Those may not be very appealing. So that may be one reason why they leak from the pipeline and don't get through to those jobs. But it's complicated. I think there's lots of reasons why people might drop out. And then, of course, there's discrimination and biases. So people who are in the labour market, who are applying for positions, are not getting them because they're being discriminated against. So there are these different aspects to underrepresentation in the labour market. So I'm going to talk a bit about the discrimination biases stuff now, which our group, Diversity in the Labour Market Group, has done a lot of work on. Here's a riddle for you. Have a look at this. A father and son are in a car crash and are rushed to hospital. The father dies, the boy is taken to the operating room, and the surgeon says, "I can't operate on this boy because he's my son." How is this possible? Have a think about this. Now, yeah, I mean, I can see some responses in chat here. Some of you may have come across this before, right? But of course, the answer to it is that the surgeon is the mother, right, not the father. But you may have heard of this one before, and of course, I've cued you into this because the topic of the talk. But 40 to 75% of people in studies using this riddle don't get it. They don't get that the mother is the surgeon. And that's quite an extraordinary number. And why is that? That's because of strong stereotypes about what men and women do and are good at. And these stereotypes exist in all of us. And we learn these stereotypes, these beliefs about other groups of people through socialization, the society we live in, which associates certain groups with certain things. And we pick these things up, even if we don't want to. We pick these associations up. Here's a nice quote from Jesse Jackson, a former Democrat politician, civil rights activist in the US. "There's nothing more painful to me at this stage in my life than to walk down the street and hear footsteps and then turn around and see somebody white and feel relieved." So he's a Black civil rights activist. And that's an example of how these stereotypes exist. And they're learned by all of us in a society. And we can't necessarily, we might not consciously hold prejudiced beliefs, but they might be influencing us in some ways. You might have seen this story a few years ago about the Starbucks in Philadelphia in America, where two guys went into Starbucks and sat down. They were Black guys. The staff asked them to leave because they hadn't bought anything. And they said they were just waiting for their friend to arrive before they bought anything. They wouldn't let them use the toilet, and then they called the police to get them thrown out. Some witnesses said they'd been there for a while. They'd also not bought anything, and no one had tried to throw them out, least of all, phone the police. So there was big protest about this, and it was featured in the news internationally. As a result of this bad publicity, Starbucks announced they would close their US stores for the day and send their employees on unconscious bias training. Right, what's unconscious bias training? Well, we'll have a little bit of a look at that in a moment. So what is prejudice, stereotyping, and discrimination? Prejudice is an attitude or judgment towards a group of people. It could be objects sometimes as well. You could think all German cars are great and love them. What we call a valenced evaluative response. And all that means is that it's you're making a judgment about a group of people and you've got some emotional feeling behind it, either positive or negative. So you can have positive prejudices, like you might think all German cars are great, or Chinese people are all hard workers. That's kind of positive. They're good at maths. Asians are good at maths. That's another stereotype. Or you can have negative ones, that certain groups of people are lazy, not good workers, and so on. Stereotypes are the actual beliefs that you hold about that group of people. So, the particular beliefs that you might have about a set of people. Women are very emotional, for example. Men are always analytical. So you have a set of beliefs belonging to that group. And discrimination is the behaviour that these things might lead to. So people can hold prejudices and stereotypes about a group, but not necessarily discriminate about them, especially if you're aware of it. You might try to be very unbiased in the way you treat people. But there tends to be something of a link between holding strong prejudices and stereotypes and actually discriminating against people. So taking actions and behaviours that lead to unfair or differential treatment with those groups. Now, these sorts of things can be either conscious or unconscious. So you can have conscious biases. We can give people questionnaires and find out how racist they are or how many racist attitudes they hold or attitudes towards women. But many of these stereotype beliefs that we have are implicit. We've learned them through socialization, through growing up in society that associates certain things with certain groups. We don't know that we're using these, and they might be influencing us. And there are certain ways that psychologists have developed implicit tests to see how strong your unconscious biases might be towards groups. This is a controversial area, and especially whether this actually really leads to real discrimination. Here's a test you can do online and test yourself. It's a sort of shoot, don't shoot test with Caucasian and African American models in it, and it flashes up very quickly, and you have to press one of two keys. You have to press the shoot key if this is somebody with a gun who's about to shoot you, and if it's someone who's holding a normal object like a mobile phone or a wallet, then you press the other key saying this person's safe. And you have to do this very, very quickly or it times out. And you could probably imagine what sorts of results you get from this. People having to press shoot, don't shoot very, very quickly. You see that typically there is a race effect, that when the target is black, people are more likely to make errors. So to shoot when they're holding just a normal object, for example. You can see a big effect here when they're armed, which is where the errors are occurring. And we see what's called an interaction here, right? So this is one example of unconscious bias, where when you have to make a very, very quick decision, that's really automatic, that you're being influenced by whether the target is Caucasian or African American, and more likely to make these errors and think that they're armed when they're not armed. Now, I talked about unconscious bias training that Starbucks were doing. And what unconscious bias training is, it uses something called the implicit association test. And the implicit association test is something that it's another reaction time test where you have to press as quickly as possible. And in this case, you get, in the race case, there are lots of these tests online. If you go to the Harvard website, you can do some of them yourself. And they look at all sorts of different groups, disabled, for example, different races. But the standard one is Caucasian and African American faces. What you have to do here is that you're told a rule that all these good words, beauty, happiness, joy, whenever you see one of them that's associated with a black face, you press the key as quickly as possible. And that these bad words might be associated with white faces. And when you see one of them, you press the key as quickly as possible. So you learn a rule, and then the rule flips over. And you have bad with one and good with the other, completely flipped. But what you find is that people are much quicker to say this is a match. So this is a white face and a good word, when that rule is in operation, than when it's a black face and a good word. They're much slower. So the idea here is that we've got learned associations that we associate negative things with black people and positive things with white people. So we're much quicker when the rule is associate good words with white faces than when the rule is associate good words with the black faces. We're much quicker to respond in this task. Now, there's mixed evidence on whether this actually leads to discriminatory behaviour. So some studies, for example, have given people this test, looked at how biased they are in terms of their associations, and then given them some sort of test of discrimination, which could sometimes be a questionnaire that asks explicit questions about whether they're biased against a group, or it could be a task in the lab that might encourage them to discriminate or not against a group. The best evidence we probably have for this is a study by our research group, by Jens Agerström and Jan-Olof Ruth, and they actually used a variation of this test with they sent out photographs on applications to real jobs in Sweden, and they manipulated the photographs, and the photograph was either an obese person who was overweight or a normal weight person. And they found that they were much more likely to get callbacks if it was a normal weight person, and less likely to get callbacks if it was an obese person. And these are real job vacancies. Now, 3 months after that, they invited all the recruiters from that study to do the IAT test with a variation with obese and non-obese faces. And they did not realise they had taken part in the earlier bit where they were assessing applications to their real vacancies in their organisations. And what they found was there was a correlation between their performance on this test and whether they were likely to discriminate in the part that came first when they tested the applications. So that's very good evidence for this, because there's a separation between those two aspects. And when people did the IAT, they didn't realise they had been participating in the recruitment experiment where they had been assessing CVs. They thought that was just part of their job. They didn't know. But we're not really sure whether performance on this test really links to discrimination in real life. And also, what we do know, though, is that it's not very good as a form of diversity training. If you just give people this test and talk about their scores, it doesn't make them any less prejudiced. So Starbucks and their unconscious bias training is rubbish. It's completely useless. Just doing this test and talking about it doesn't make you less prejudiced. So anytime you see unconscious bias training, be very skeptical about it, because this is a useful test and it's interesting to show implicit biases, but it's doubtful whether we can use this to train people to be less biased. What sort of recruitment biases do we see in recruiters? People tend to, when they're recruiting, they tend to recruit people who are very similar to them. And assume that anybody in their social group is like them, and people in other social groups must be different to them. Confirmation bias, so we look for things to confirm an original impression and ignore things to disconfirm. So if someone walks in the room and it's an Islamic woman wearing a hijab, you may not like that. And if you don't like that, then you may just look for things in her interview performance that are bad. So you're only looking for the bad things to confirm your initial impression. You're not really looking for the good things. Similar to me biases, where people favour applicants who have exactly the same background as them. So, for example, if they went to the same university or did the same degree, this is quite strong recruiter bias. We see similar to me biases operate quite a lot in recruitment and selection. Relatedly, affinity bias. You choose a candidate and prefer a candidate at interview because you feel you've got something in common with them. For example, maybe you hit it off, maybe they're socially skilled and you feel like you had a really nice interaction with them. You might think that this is a good indicator of whether you can work with someone, but it actually turns out to be very poorly related to performance in the job. So using these sorts of biases to recruit people is not a very good way to recruit the best people in jobs. Halo and horn effect. So if you find out something positive about a person, then you see everything else about them in a positive light. The horn effect is the opposite, where if you find out something you think is negative, and then you try to see everything else in a negative light. Expectation anchor, which is related to those halo and horn effects, where we allow ourselves to anchor onto a particular piece of information to make decisions. So, for example, you might weight a particular characteristic too highly. The fact that maybe the candidate for this job, maybe they just look similar to the person who did the job before, or they come from a similar background to the person who did the job before. So this becomes the anchor in your mind that you're then comparing all the other people to. This isn't a very good way to choose the best talent for your jobs either. So all these biases actually don't really help you choose the best person for the job. And they also mean you're going to get more homogeneity in organisations. So you're going to get less diversity if people are picking on stuff that they have an affinity with, or it's like them in some way. So how do we avoid those biases? Clear job role specifications. So when you're evaluating people for a job, you have a clear set of criteria, and you preferably want to be trying to score them on those criteria. So not just like this particular thing, they look like the person who did the job before, they went to the university I went to, but you've got a clear set of job role specifications to judge people on. So you're judging people on what the job involves and not your own biases, whether you like them or not. Training interviewers, things like blind resume screening, where you don't see the name of the person, so you can't judge their gender or their ethnicity. Standardized questions, that you ask every candidate the same sets of questions. And many companies use third-party recruiters, which can avoid some of these biases. If you're not going to be the manager working with that person, then they can be a bit more objective. So research. So for the last part of this, I'm just going to talk about some of the research that we've done in our group, which is a diversity in the labour market group. And I'm going to talk about a few of the main characteristics that we've looked at in our research in our group. The first one is gender. Now, this might be surprising to quite a lot of people, but we have, although we sometimes find evidence of gender biases against women, actually what we're finding more recently is that there are either no gender biases in hiring and in the labour market in terms of recruitment. And if there are, it tends to be related to men being discriminated against in female-dominated professions. So this is done in Nordic countries and in Sweden, a lot of the work. And Sweden and Nordic countries are known for being very gender equal. So this might be different in other countries and cultures. But a quite recent study in 6 countries, including Germany, the Netherlands, Norway, Spain, UK, and US, very different cultures on cultural dimension scores in terms of gender equity. This study that looked at 6 countries actually found very little evidence, again, of gender biases by sending out fictitious applications to real vacancies and measuring callback rates. But they did find some evidence that, again, males in female-dominated professions, for example, like nursing or care work, were more discriminated against. In STEM, for example, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, we sometimes find women being discriminated against, like in this particular study here that was done in Israel, where it seemed that male and female managers were using different sets of criteria to judge male and female applicants for jobs. And that we know that women are put off from any sort of macho type competitive workplaces. So if STEM jobs have very competitive sort of language, then that will put women off. But again, there's sometimes found no discrimination against women in STEM, or even sometimes a bias towards women in STEM because there are so few of them applying. So this is not exactly the pattern that is the sort of traditional one that people thought we might see. But of course, we still find that there is a pipeline problem with only certain types of people getting to the top in organisations. But from what we can tell from our research, this seems to be more likely to be to do with other factors rather than discrimination. So it's factors like the fact that women take maternity leave, that may not be very generous in some countries at all. Even though it is in Sweden, there's still differences in women's pay in Sweden, even though it has the most generous parental leave. There seem to be factors in place that might be reinforcing this homogeneity and lack of diversity that might not be down to explicit discrimination. But it does seem that as a general rule, that when we see discrimination against men and women, it is in professions that seem to be non-male or female dominated. So women can be evaluated negatively when they apply for traditionally masculine jobs where they're assertive and competitive, and men might be evaluated more favourably in those jobs and less favourably in jobs relating to care, for example, elderly care, daycare. So I think that slide might be on there, but yeah, so it matches the stereotypes for your gender. And if you're applying for jobs that are typically seen as being stereotypically the other gender, then you're more likely to be discriminated against based on stereotypes. You would think that in a progressive country like Sweden, that there was no discrimination based on sexual orientation, but it turns out there is. But it's a complicated picture again. So some research from our group that sent job applications to 4,000 different employers in 10 different occupations in Sweden, changed the details as to whether it was heterosexual or gay male or lesbian applicants. The gay male applicant was discriminated against in male-dominated occupations. Lesbian applicant was discriminated against in typical female-dominated occupations. So you see some of the similar patterns that you see with gender, that gay men are seen to be of probably more have more female-like characteristics, more feminine characteristics, so they might be more suited to care jobs and less suited to more masculine professions, and lesbians the opposite. So we're seeing some sort of similar patterns related to how people stereotype relating to particular occupations here. A nationwide survey, again in Sweden from our group, found that actually gay men were more likely to be satisfied with their job than heterosexual men. Lesbians were less satisfied, though. And here you can see a difference between gay men and gay women, which is why it's really important to collect disaggregated data from gay men and gay women when we do these sorts of surveys. And a more recent study which looked at customer and worker discrimination. So this was a study that was online, which was run with university students, and they presented as opening a new restaurant, and this was either gay men or lesbian or heterosexual owners opening the restaurant. And they asked how positive they would be towards this, and also whether they would likely to apply for a job there, and how much the wages they would want to earn. And they found that there was less positive treatment to lesbian owners of the restaurant, but there was less interest in taking a job if there were gay men who were the owners of the restaurant. So we're seeing some different patterns again here between the sorts of stereotypes people might have for gay men and for gay women. And participants increased their wage demands with lesbian owners and when more women were included in the group of owners. So they demanded more money to work under women. Interesting. We know that there's age discrimination as well. So again, studies from our group in Sweden that show that, in fact, age discrimination kicks in at about 35 to 40, which is quite worrying that age discrimination kicks in at that point in time. It's pretty young for age discrimination to kick in. And this was a field experiment, again, sending out fictitious applications for real vacancies and looking at callback rates. And there's a difference between men and women here as well. So it was a steeper curve for women. So older women were more discriminated against than older men. So older women in particular are being discriminated against. You can see here intersectionality. So when two things combine, being a woman and being older, that you get particularly different responses than to any of those two things on their own. So intersectionality, where we see different combinations of identity, does it always turn out negatively? Well, it turns out there's some interesting research from our group, from Andrea Strinich, that shows that sometimes a combination of two disadvantaged groups together can actually result in a positive. So she did a task where she gave a description of different people to a set of recruiters in Sweden, and she asked them to rate how warm and how competent do you think these people would be? And she found some interesting results. That generally, what we can say here is that an Arab female is judged least favourably of all these groups. So an Arab woman she's a little bit more warm than an Arab man, but and she's seen as the least competent of any potential employee. But what happens when you you add to Arab woman that she's homosexual, she's a lesbian. What amazing thing happens is that suddenly competence increases, and so does warmth. Now, this is an interesting result because people had all often very much assumed that when you had two categories of disadvantage coming together, that person might be doubly disadvantaged. But this actually shows that there can also be positive effects. And we think this might be happening because the homosexuality cue is probably making the Arab woman seem atypical, that she doesn't seem to be like maybe a typical stereotypical Arab woman. So how do we reduce the factors that hinder inclusion? We can try and reduce prejudices by using more standardized techniques in selection and interviewing, for example. And we can also try to recruit more people from underrepresented groups. So if fewer girls, for example, are going into STEM subjects, we can target schools and try to promote STEM subjects with girls. We can go to neighbourhoods that are poor, neighbourhoods that have more ethnic minority groups, and try to target recruitment there. If we've got underrepresentation, we can also do things like branding. So we can make sure that recruitment materials are inclusive, that they mention how inclusive they are as an employer, and that they show they are doing active things to increase diversity and inclusion in their workplace. And that's what some of my recent research has been about. I'll put the references here. You can find these on our website as well. So my recent work has been, how is it that organisations can signal through their branding that they are inclusive and diverse, and therefore encourage more applicants from underrepresented groups. So that's some of the things that you can also be done to increase underrepresentation that we've been looking at in our group. So that's the way to try to reduce discrimination and increase diversity and inclusion, to tackle it through different holistic methods, through both recruitment, advertising, selection procedures, and also when people are in the job, through making sure we evaluate them based on very clear standard criteria, so biases don't creep in. Okay, so that's it. So I've gone over, of course. I knew I was going to talk too much, but I'm happy to take questions and stick around as well if people want to ask questions. So this is just a slide showing our group and the web address for the pages are mostly in Swedish, but there is an English landing page as well. So we're a mixture of psychologists and economists. And you can find a list of our publications from the group on the website there if you're interested in looking in more detail into the research that we do. Yeah, so any questions?
Thank you so much, Amanda. We open up for questions.
I have one question.
Mm.
Daniel from Media Institute for you. I work with diversity in my organization, and something that I tend to kind of stumble upon is that we're a Swedish organization, but we also work on an international level, and the wording, the terms are quite different when it comes to English compared to Swedish. When you talk about race, for example, how can you even start to translate that into Swedish context? So I find it to be very sensitive when it comes to different cultural contexts. And also, it feels like this subject is evolving a lot quicker outside of Sweden, and we're kind of, not falling behind, but, following. Do you have any comment? Any advice on how we can keep ourselves up to date with the use of terms?
Yeah, I agree with you, firstly, that Sweden is always a bit of an exception, right? It's famous Swedish exceptionalism. And so Sweden does things, and I think the Nordic countries do things a bit differently to, certainly, for example, the UK and US. And partly this ties to the histories of immigration in these countries as well. And what are people's concerns about discrimination? So in the US UK context, if you talk about discrimination in the labour market or diversity in the labour market, people immediately think about race, ethnicity. If you talk about that in Sweden, people immediately think about gender. And because, you know, typically, historically, those factors have been the important things. And of course, more recently, Sweden has had lots of immigration over a short period. So it's now becoming more pressing that we have to address inclusion and diversity based on ethnic background. And it is tricky because, as you say, even the language is difficult. We don't tend to use the term race. We tend to use that term a lot less in Europe generally than it does America. We tend to use the term ethnic background. And there are even how do we monitor or collect data on representation in the labour market in Sweden, for example, if we don't collect data on what people's ethnic background is, because we can't really describe it, because there haven't been standardized terms to ask about people's ethnic background in Sweden, for example, and some other countries. So in the UK, for example, there is a 10-yearly census and people know exactly what their ethnic group is from the census. So when I give questionnaires to UK samples and have an open question, what's your ethnic background? Everyone writes in white British, black British, Asian British, etc. If you ask that question in Sweden, which I have, you get many diverse responses, including people who say, this is a stupid question, I don't know what you mean, because Sweden has what's called a colourblind approach to ethnicity and race, in that there's a tendency to say, oh, well, we're all the same. Nobody sees any differences. Whereas some countries like the UK take multicultural approaches where differences between people are recognised. Now, there's research on which approach is best in different circumstances. And there are problems with colour blindness because it tends to overlook discrimination based on ethnic background. Say, oh, no, well, we treat everyone the same. So if you don't acknowledge that there actually are differences between people that people can see, and that's affecting their behaviour, we know, for example, we know from our own research group that there is massive discrimination against Arabic Muslim job applicants in Sweden. Huge. You send out a CV, it's identical. Someone who was born in Sweden, went to university here, qualified for the job. Clearly, they speak the language, they're Swedish. If you change the name from Anders to Mohammed, the callback rate drops 40%. So we know that it's happening. So it's a problem because we've got to be able to name this to deal with it. And what I would say is, if you check the Linnaeus website and find my PhD thesis, which I finished last year, I talk about a lot of these topics in much more detail, and particularly about the Swedish context. So I would say, have a look, check that out, because that might be of interest to you. And feel free to email me as well if you want to discuss anything more.
Will do. Thank you.
No problem. But that was a good question, yeah.
More questions? Okay, thank you so much, Amanda. I think this was a really, really nice lecture, and I learned a lot, and I really enjoyed listening to you. So thank you so much for everything. And thank you all people who came and listened to us, and hope you can also join us next time.